I want to find. Are we recording?
We're live now.
Okay, I want to find, and maybe you already know, we finished Sense and Sensibility, but where did we start? Where did we leave off last time?
So I have us starting today's reading at 201, which is right at that kind of
Volume 3, Chapter 4.
Yeah,
it was like right when. Okay, so when we stopped, Colonel Brandon was offering Ferrars a
living,
yes,
as a
and then there were lots of understandings, and we joked. Yeah, I got a couple things I'll start us off with.
Yeah,
we joked that one of the things we like about maybe spending more days on Austin is you get to prove on video how wrong you were, and then busted wrong. So, it's both kind of embarrassing and charming to me that, I think I expressed a certain certitude that Brandon and Eleanor were going to be the ones that wound up together. I just didn't see it coming that maybe the Lucy and Edward thing was a mirage.
Well, it wasn't.
And it looked like Brandon and Eleanor were getting closer. It didn't occur to me that the whole time Brandon's still into Marianne. So I don't know if that was uncareful reading or just being surprised. So I'll own that. There's stuff you've written down that I've written down, and we'll get to all that. But I just want to say, I celebrated Austin's patience a lot first couple of weeks, but I think maybe I was a little disappointed and felt like she did not stick the landing, that maybe she waited too long. It was at about 15 pages left that all of a sudden she's scrambling to make it all. And it felt like scrambling to me a little bit. It felt like the theme all of a sudden became luck to me, which maybe is her point. I mean, granted. But when you're that painstakingly artistic about every chess move, and then all of a sudden it's because Robert jilted Edward, now Eleanor can have him. And then Marianne, simply because what else is she going to do? Marries Brandon. And now they're, and it's wow. You just basically, really, I don't know how much of any of that had to do with their characteristics, the value of Sense and Sensibility. I was bothered by that. I was also, I'll say this, a little flabbergasted by it. And to Austin's credit, you feel like you know the characters as people by the time you get to the end.
Mm-hmm.
So I found myself wanting to argue with characters like my students do, right?
Right.
I was
makes sense.
I was why are you guys all acting like Willoughby's excuses somehow redeem? I don't understand. If anything, it's worse. And maybe I'm wrong here, maybe you can help me, but what I hear him saying is, for a minute there, I almost accepted poverty because I was starting to feel feelings for Marianne. So some of what I was doing, that was heartfelt. But then in the end, I'm expensive, and so I stopped. And Eleanor is oh, he meant it for a minute. Mm-hmm. Now I'm warmer to him. And I'm just I don't ever remember any girls letting me off the hook for that kind of an excuse. I meant it for a second. Why is Willoughby at all so... Plus, the way he left Brandon's charge high and dry, that's an afterthought. I don't understand some of the moral judgments that are being laid down at the end, not the least of which is Marianne almost being killed for what seems to me is punishment for being too selfish and too emotional. So a little bit of problems for me that maybe you can correct or help me get through, or maybe you're going to reinforce. I don't know.
I have to say, I really only wrote down 4 things. That I wanted to talk about in this bit of reading. It wasn't a terribly long bit of reading.
No.
But I'm 100% on board with your judgment of this feeling a bit rushed in the ending. I also feel and here's maybe where I'm going to going to disagree, but if so, it's going to be very oblique in its disagreement. I'm going to say that I don't want to say that I think things work out to luck, although there certainly was some elements of sort of like the unexpected or the unlikely. In this, I want to make a bit of a case, and I suspect other people have made a much better version of this argument than I'm going to make. That this thing that you're describing as luck is really a kind of fundamental articulation of the values of this sphere.
Yeah.
But it's sloppy in a way that makes it feel like it's like luck and chance.
Yeah.
I think is what I'll say about that. The thing with Willoughby, really the thing with all the men, and I suppose this is a certain privilege speaking, but I think all of the men sort of, well, I say all the men, the men who were sort of players in the relationships here, so Edward, Willoughby, and Brandon, all get a certain kind of pass that feels sort of familiar to me, that's kind of like, so no war crimes,
right?
And like not actively trying to murder me, so you're a decent guy.
Yeah.
Like never once grabbed a jogger off the street, threw her in her van. Okay, well, what a good guy you are. I mean, it just feels like a real low bar.
He comes back, he's like talking about how he's drunk, and even Eleanor's like, you drank a pint? Like, the whole thing is so...
Yeah.
Like, yes, there's a pass that Eleanor, as the moral center of the book, Eleanor is the most complicit figure in Edward getting a pass for basically being a coward, Brandon getting a pass for like, I know not what, maybe he's the best of them all, maybe, we can talk about this. Willoughby getting a pass for being a little bit less of a dick than we thought, because for a minute he loved Marianne and he's sorry she's dying. But, like, I was just a little disappointed in Eleanor, but it might be that a girl was just tired by the end of the book. And was like, you know what? Like, I'm tired of everybody turning to me, so you know what? Fine. That might have been what she was doing.
I can kind of hear a bit of that, right? Like, like Marianne almost dies.
Yeah.
And I'm going to agree with what I think I hear you saying here, that this is essentially the narrative recognizing that she somehow has to suffer grave punishment for not being serious enough.
Yeah.
Even though her lack of seriousness is minuscule compared to Willoughby's.
Right.
Right? Like, she has to nearly die.
Right.
To somehow redeem herself.
Yeah.
Eleanor has to suffer through this. And I mean, I'm feeling, for various things that we've talked about in other settings, I'm feeling, I don't know, I don't want to say this, I don't want to sound like I'm boasting. So when I say I'm sensitive, I'm not trying to say a quality of my character, but rather a rawness.
Yeah.
These days about the way people worry about the people they love.
Yeah.
And so I had this real something for Eleanor while Marianne was like hanging
there. Absolutely.
And like her,
That's a beautifully done part of the book. Like, I mean, even though I think it's kind of like I have intellectual moral problems with what she did, but as far as executing it, it was really well written and emotional.
Yeah, the sort of underlying values, I think I want to maybe question a little bit.
Yeah.
But the kind of tenterhooks of, I mean, and I can say at this point with full confidence, this is my first reading of this book.
Me too.
I thought I had read it, maybe, but I definitely hadn't. And I spent a couple hours, like, genuinely thinking, like, wow, she's going to kill Marianne.
Right, I did too.
I was just, like, kind of blown away.
I thought, well, especially last week, I said a little glibly, or 2 weeks ago, I said something like, well, as the avatar of sensibility, maybe Marianne has to go down. But I was also thinking in the back of my mind, but it's Jane Austen, so go down isn't going to mean die.
Right. Yeah.
And then I was like, holy God. Like, yeah.
I mean, maybe I've just been, like, watching too much Game of Thrones. Yeah. I was just kind of like, this feels on the table all of a sudden.
Yes.
Yes. And it was shocking. I
Yeah.
mean, in this, I mean, I know it sounds like the 19th century parlor,
Yeah.
but it was shocking to me when I really, for a second, thought like, oh my God, Marianne's gonna die.
And also, given the way the other characters were responding, like Jennings, who by this point has earned your trust,
Right. Right.
is like saying, "Listen, I've seen this before. She's going to die." Meanwhile, the
Right.
doctor,
Right.
who's kind of a dick,
Yeah.
is like, "Oh, she'll be fine." And it turned out the doctor was right, and that
Yeah,
was
but he
interesting.
Was he was kind of right without being right.
Yeah, yeah.
He's like, well, we'll just do this and it'll be fine.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, we'll do this other thing, but this is really the good. We should have done this from the start.
Yes,
It's all
yes.
this like weird,
Yeah.
We'll do this absolute last chance. I never tried this except in emergencies, but it'll be fine.
Yes, yes.
Kind of medicine. But so
Which was Austin having fun, I think, with the culture of medicine at
I
the
think
time.
there's a little something, especially women's medicine.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And I can't remember if I ever told you about this, but one of my committee members for my master's program specifically did Victorian women's medicine stuff, and wrote this whole book about kind of like, the sort of like unknowable female body,
Right.
In its like 19th century medicine and literature.
Yeah.
And what I'll never forget is the cover of her book. It included this little detail from a painting where a physician is examining a woman, but like through a sheet.
Yeah, yeah,
He's
yeah.
just like,
He's like, ah.
yeah,
yeah.
and this kind of unknowability.
Yeah,
of this,
that's
like,
that's
who
fascinating.
knows what it goes on in there.
Yeah, it's all
kind
so
of thing.
different for men.
And-
I think
and-
all of that
and just
is
medicine
fair.
in general at the time.
Yeah.
But to kind of bring this back to the Willoughby question,
Yeah.
right? Like I don't know that the book is really saying this, but I did have this kind of vague sense that Eleanor had weathered. I mean, let's be frank here. Eleanor has weathered a tough year,
Yeah.
right? Like they move,
The brother cuts him off financially.
right? They're poor. There's the stuff with Edward's weird first visit. There's the stuff with Willoughby. She's been the only adult in the room for
Yeah.
a long time.
Yeah.
And I kind of get this feeling that like we get to I forget the name of the house they're in. I know it's her brother and
Yeah.
his wife's house. And Marianne falls ill, and I kind of get the feeling that like she is literally like at the very end of her tether.
Yeah.
And she comes through this thing, and maybe, and I think I'm maybe leaning a little bit into this thing that I want to be true, that could or could not, possibly be true. I don't know, but I think in having weathered all of this, I think has softened, has taken one step towards sensibility.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah.
Has kind of said like, look, those feelings were real.
A balance.
They felt real.
Yeah.
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 And so maybe I should pay a little more attention to that.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it's a balance or a little bit of a defeat
Yeah.
or resignation, but I feel like when Willoughby arrives, I mean,
He is all the pieces.
he is, she is, like
Yeah.
they all are.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I mean, like in a 21st century narrative, right? Like they probably would have just like ended up sleeping together,
Right.
because they were both just so shattered.
Yeah, yeah,
This
yeah.
just is,
Yeah.
and I suppose in a way, I mean, this is kind of the equivalent, or they share this secret
Yeah,
about
yeah.
his feelings.
Yeah, yeah.
But so I want to say I'm not giving up on this sort of judgment. Like Willoughby is not redeemed in my mind.
Yeah.
The fact that Eleanor can find some soft feeling toward him is to her credit.
Yeah.
But as far as I'm concerned, like Willoughby could just ride his horse off a cliff, and we'd be just fine.
Society would be better off without
We'd be just
Willoughby,
fine.
I think.
So
and-
there is that. But the thing that makes me want to swing back to, and this is one of the things you mentioned earlier, and I wrote down. They're part of the plot here, and I'm reminded of the trope in Scooby-Doo that I think was really about saving the animators some work, but the trope of the hallway with many doors.
Yeah.
And the people running through them, and like, you know, the ghost is chasing them, and then they're chasing the ghost, and then the ghost is wearing one of their hats, and then they're wearing the sheet.
Yeah, that's right.
And I feel like, especially the last 50 pages, was so full of these fraught misunderstandings.
Yeah.
The first of which really kicks off right at the beginning of today's reading.
Yeah.
And it felt a little. It felt like a carnival trick to me. It felt like a little cheap thing, creating this tension, sometimes that we knew and sometimes that we didn't. I'm thinking of two kind of main misunderstandings here. The first is Mrs. Jennings' misunderstanding of what Colonel Brandon is offering Eleanor.
Right.
That takes us about 10 pages to unravel.
Yeah.
Now we know all along,
right?
Because we've seen Polonius go behind the arrows.
Yeah.
We know all along, and in a way it became a bit of a drudge for me to know.
Like watching Three's Company or something.
Yeah, you know, there's gonna be this you know, and this has been like a major part of the narrative, right? This older person kind of like spying on younger people with this kind of titillation of like who's pairing with whom, and you know, and it really just feels like creepy dad at the sleepover in some ways to me. But there's this misunderstanding, and then this more fundamental misunderstanding about Robert Ferrars, you know, being, you know, Mr. Ferrars, marrying Lucy, and part of me wants to kind of say, you know, because this is Jane Austen and because this is kind of high art, you know, kind of untouchable, like, you know, of course she didn't make any mistakes. Part of me wants to say that this is this kind of commentary about the grave distance that this community invokes, that this kind of society invokes, that that you know, this use of titles, for instance, is just a recipe for this kind of misunderstanding.
Yeah.
You know. And there's even, you know, a couple times where, you know, the editor, who I just think has done a fantastic job, right?
I was going to talk about her introduction a little bit in a moment.
But there's a couple points where she had to kind of step in with footnotes. And kind of say, not that, Miss Steele.
And
that kind of thing. And so part of me thinks that this is a bit of a criticism of the kind of, you know, stiff, formal, at arm's length that everybody has in this kind of Victorian. I guess this is pre-Victorian, isn't it?
It's like 1811, so I mean,
right around. We'll call it Victorian or Victorian adjacent. Kind of moment. But in my heart, I think it's not really that. It's a kind of a cheap trick that is how she generates some tension. You know, for the very end, and also how she gets Edward off the hook in order to save Eleanor, and which I kind of resent in a way, both the cheap trickness of it and the idea that Eleanor somehow needs Edward to redeem her, which I think is built into the book. But so, you know, these misunderstandings could be really fun. Right. These could be light. They could be, you know, this kind of neat little kind of plot device. But when the entire plot turns on that hinge, I feel like it needs to be more than a simple misunderstanding.
I mean, I agree with that. And, you know, speaking of Johnson, her introduction is really great. And the paratext is great. I mean, I read a lot of these articles, including Eve Sedgwick's Wild.
Right.
So, did you read that one?
Yeah, that was one early on.
Eve Sedgwick article that I don't know when it's published. It's well, since I'm bringing it up, I'll go find the date of publication. It's in the book. The Eve Sedgwick essay is called Jane Austen and the Masturbating Girl. It's from a book she published in 1993 called Tendencies. There's a section of it, and sort of pointing out the eroticism of the bedroom scene between Eleanor and Marianne when Marianne's writing her last letter to Willoughby, and suggesting that maybe something was going on with Marianne other than just crying, and then just like launches into this discussion about rhetoric about both men and women masturbating in Austen's time and how she was appropriating some of that. So that was, kind of a Freudian psychosexual reading that I thought was pretty good. I also read Marilyn Butler's Sensibility of the Worship of Self. She gave a couple pages there. That was good. Mary Poovey, Ideological Contradictions in the Constellation of Form. That was really good. I didn't get to all of them. But in the introduction, Johnson talks about how, like you said, this is your first time with Sensibility. It's mine as well. The Jane Austen novels that I am absolutely positive that I have read are Pride and Prejudice, Emma, and Mansfield Park. Like, I know I've read all three of those. But Mansfield Park I read in such a rush and so long ago that I barely remember anything about it. Emma, because of the great movie Clueless, I feel like I know, and I read that for graduate school too. I know that book in and out. But Johnson points out something interesting that people that haven't read a lot of Austen think that Pride and Prejudice is the template.
Right.
In as much as everything's like jangly and virtue wins completely, and the beau is completely wealthy,
right,
and energetic and vigorous and
right,
has integrity and is unimpeachable, except for he has to learn how to deal with his feelings. And Pride and Prejudice marries off the two oldest daughters to fabulous wealth. But Sense and Sensibility, when as it became more, evidently according to Johnson, as critics began to sort of bring it out and give it its own due, according to her, Austen's canon becomes clear that Pride and Prejudice is kind of the mirage of the novels, and that, with its darkness and the fact that, what you called the battle axe women, widows, just like sort of floating around, destroying everyone within their reach, and even like just the power players financially, like Robert Ferrars taking advantage of his brother's disinheritance, and Eleanor's brother John being so brutal about money. All those folks in a way, including Willoughby, marrying for money. All those folks in a way really do win. The power structure of the novel that Austen is critiquing, the structure that elevates assholes, I'll just say it, wins. And Eleanor and Marianne just barely escape by the skin of their teeth. And I think, like, for reasons you and I have both laid out, you're calling it maybe a cheap trick, I'm calling it maybe luck. I think what Johnson wants us to think is something more like, yeah, because that's the only way as a young woman you're gonna navigate this if you're not completely landed and wealthy, is if lightning strikes. Otherwise, we're all screwed, and that's Austen's point, and the novel is therefore pretty grim. So there's this one passage.
I bet I was just about to point out the same thing.
Where Johnson writes,
Dark and Disenchanted.
No, this is a little bit different. It says, what is important to know is what kinds of public status and what sorts of behavior give a man or woman credibility. These are like a series of rhetorical questions on Roman numeral 12. What is important to know? What kinds of evidence do we consult when we form judgments about people? Do we consider their tastes, their status in the neighborhood, the source of their income, the extent of their property, their words, their conduct, their hunting dogs? Eleanor does stand apart from so many of them in as much as she's like, yeah, but this guy, I like him, or yeah, but I don't, rather than just... But there's this passage on page 210 where she's arguing with Robert, or maybe it's her brother. Let me see. Yeah, it's John. It's her brother. And John's defending Mrs. Ferrars. And he says, Mrs. Ferrars can never forget that Edward is her son. Eleanor, you surprise me. I should think it must have nearly escaped her memory by this time. John, you wrong her exceedingly. Mrs. Ferrars is one of the most affectionate mothers in the world. Eleanor was silent. We think now, said Mr. Dashwood after a short pause, of Robert's marrying Miss Morton. Miss Morton's the wealthy woman that they want.
Right.
Eleanor, smiling at the grave and decisive importance of her brother's tone, calmly replied, the lady, I suppose, has no choice in the affair. John, choice? How do you mean?
Yeah.
And I thought that little exchange there, I resonated with what Johnson wrote like I thought of that passage when I read her talking about how hard it is to make judgments about people. And one of the things that makes it hard is all these people are operating in a world where Eleanor and Marianne, and by extension Miss Morton in this exchange, they don't even have the right to make judgments anyway. Like, even if you could.
Right.
Like, so it's a really grim novel in ways that I think really get you at the end.
Well, in a similar way, I marked up this thing on page 266.
Okay.
Where we finally kind of understand what happened with the kind of 3-card Monty.
Yeah.
Lucy, right? So Edward, after being cut off by his mother, right, who were just, this is exactly what we were just talking about. Tries to release Lucy from the promise.
Yeah.
Right? He says, look, this is a really different situation.
We're going to be poor.
And you didn't agree to that, so maybe you want to walk away, and I'm saying that's fair. Right? But she's like, no, right?
Yeah.
And there's kind of an interesting sort of conversation about this much later. But so he sends Robert, right, to kind of like explain to her.
Or somebody does.
He does.
Okay.
On 265, 266, this is, but on the top of 266, but though, this is for our, well, let me just jump down to the part that stood out to me. He sends Robert, and he says, some doubts always lingered in her mind. This is about the middle of 266. Some doubts always lingered in her mind when they parted, which could only be removed by another half-hour's discourse with himself. His attendance was by this means secured, right? So he's come to talk her out of marrying Edward.
And she keeps saying, oh, I don't know.
And so he keeps coming back.
Yeah.
His attendance was by this means secured, and the rest followed in course. Instead of talking of Edward, they came gradually to talk only of Robert, a subject on which he always had more to say on than any other.
Yes.
And in which she soon betrayed an interest even equal to his own. And in short, it became speedily evident to both that he had entirely supplanted his brother. He was proud of his conquest, proud of tricking Edward, and very proud of marrying privately without his mother's consent. And one of the things I think is really interesting, and this, for me, this kind of fits back into this section of the introduction that I thought you were going to cite on Roman numeral 14.
Yeah, let's find that.
Right at the very top there, Johnson writes, this is a dark and disenchanted novel that exposes how those sacred and supposedly benevolizing institutions of order, property, marriage, and family, can enforce avarice, selfishness, and mediocrity.
Yeah, that I found that to be really persuasive too.
But here's the thing that I think is kind of interesting about this. In a way, Lucy shows the most sense of anybody in the book. And we're supposed to dislike her. I get it.
Yeah.
What is when she first...
Edward's like, well, she was my first crush, but then I started to meet other girls, and I was like, oh, dear God, what have I done? And I was like, you're kind of a dick.
Right.
You know?
I realized she was dumb.
Yeah, like her letters. I couldn't stand...
Yeah.
It's like, how... Like, and Eleanor's a bit of a snob. So, yes.
And Austen is not kind to Lucy.
She's signing off on all this.
Right. There's the bit where she first meets Mrs. Ferrars. And Mama Ferrars, who is being so nice to Lucy specifically as a way to insult Eleanor. Yeah. Right. And then Lucy's treating it like this coup and brags to Eleanor, and she says, "Did you see how she condescended to me?" Right?
Yeah.
Doesn't know the right word.
Right.
And it's this really damning and I feel like this kind of reflects back too, right? Because like as a reader, you're reminded of the judgments that you make and the kind of complicity you have with the same kind of dark, sort of thing. But at the same time, Lucy wasn't marrying Edward; she was marrying the fortune.
Right.
Right. And so when the fortune passed to Robert, she was like, "All right, I'm going to make a choice."
Which was John's point.
Yeah.
When he was like, well, since Edward's not going to marry Ms. Morton, why not Robert? Right. Yeah.
And so Lucy of her own accord, in part because she is uncouth.
Yeah.
Which I suppose we could also say, means like she's not limited by these stupid rules.
Right.
Right. I don't know if she sees through it or she's this like savant, who's just kind of like, oh, was I not supposed to? Oh, I thought I was supposed to go get all the money.
Yeah.
But cuts right to the core of the thing.
Yeah.
And says like, so she did, and then now you, okay, let's keep talking.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Until very quickly, right, and with like quite a bit of panache, the story becomes, ooh, Robert tricked him.
And it's funny because the last time we saw Robert, he was bragging to Eleanor about how he didn't even think Lucy was all that interesting or pretty.
Right.
And all of a sudden it's like, oh yeah, you did. You did.
Or whatever. Right?
Yeah.
But Lucy did the work.
Yes.
Like she saw what needed to be done.
Yeah.
And not only did she make it happen, but she made Robert feel like he had won some game of three-dimensional chess against his own brother.
Right.
In the process.
Right.
Right. And so I think, in a way, and this is grim, right?
Yeah.
This is not about love.
No. None of it.
This is like, 1980s Wall Street type stuff.
Yeah. Which was Austin's point, I think.
Yeah, this is a hostile takeover.
Like, both Eleanor and Marianne wish to not play that game. That is one of the things that they share. Like, they both, for all their differences, for all Marianne's romanticism and all Eleanor's adult in the room, they both very much would prefer to marry someone who they like and admire and can stand to be in a room with. That's something that they share that I think Lucy is much more eye-rolly about. She's like, so what? I'll just leave the room. It'll be my room. It'll be my house,
right. Yeah, I think the difference there, right, is that and this is kind of the snobbery that you're pointing out, that Eleanor and Marianne, like whatever else, they fundamentally believe in this system.
Yeah.
And I think Lucy does this other thing.
Yeah.
I think she thinks she believes in the system, but and this is a hobby horse of mine, so I may be stretching a little bit to make this work, but one of my favorite things in the stuff I study, which is I guess around the same time period, but in the U.S. South, one of my favorite things is this moment when like the lower classes misperform upper class behavior, right?
Yeah.
Like a brawl that is supposed to somehow serve the same purpose as a duel.
Or even like the modernist period with the Snopeses and Faulkner, where the Snopeses ape aristocratic manners, but in this way that is like, oh dear God.
While they pick your pocket, repossess your house and everything, and sell you a pony that won't ever let you ride it.
Yeah.
But it's often framed as this kind of misperformance, like, oh, they don't understand.
Yeah.
But peeking around that frame to us, the modern readers, is this realization of like, no. They understand. They're just not interested in like the sort of like civilized veneer that you guys are invested in. So Marianne and Eleanor, I think, are really genuinely invested in this idea that like, oh, this is the world. This is how it must be.
Yes.
And Lucy's like, give me my money.
Yes. Yes.
And in a way, I admire this. Like, I mean, she's kind of a psychopath,
right?
In this exchange, but at risk of kind of like misquoting Coppola from Apocalypse Now. I mean, like, this is the world. It is. There are no rules here, man.
Yeah, and as far as the three ladies, when you compare Lucy, Eleanor, and Marianne, you certainly could say, I think without cutting it too thin, you could say that they all three got what they wanted. But Marianne's seems the most forced to me. I mean, I really, like you said, like me thinking they were going to kill her kind of flabbergasted me and reinforced Johnson's point that, listen, it's not always Pride and Prejudice. I think the quiet part that she was saying out loud there is, Austen could have killed her, and it would have been a Jane Austen novel.
Right.
Like I think that there is, but at the bottom of 267, I'm just like, geez, really? For the most, in some ways, the heart of the book. This is what we're going to say. It was now her darling object. Precious, bottom of 267, as was the company of her daughter to her. This is Mrs. Dashwood.
Mm-hmm. Right, because Eleanor's already been married.
Yeah. She desired nothing so much as to give up its constant enjoyment to her valued friend, this guy who, I mean, I know it's 1805 when she starts writing it, and it's 1811 when it gets published, but even the characters in this book acknowledge 35 and 16, a little weird. But Mrs. Dashwood's committed. To see Marianne settled at the mansion house was equally the wish of Edward and Eleanor. They each felt his sorrows and their own obligations, and Marianne, by general consent, was to be the reward. Mm-hmm. It's like, Brandon's been through enough. He deserves his toy now. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I know that that's harsh. Like, he does love her, but I don't know that Austen really believes that a man's suffering means he deserves the woman to be his woman. Like, that feels very 2023, like incel kind of stuff to me.
Right.
It goes on. With such a confederacy against her, with a knowledge so intimate of his goodness, with a conviction of his fond attachment to herself, which at last, though long after it was observable to everybody else, burst on her, what could she do? And that's like 2 pages away from the end. And Austen goes on to say, well, she came to love him as much as she ever loved Willoughby. But to me, I just feel like, wow, that's, of the 3 women, I just can't help but feel like Marianne ends up the least happy of the 3 ingenues, as it were. That Lucy got what she wanted. Like you say, she got her money. And, she couldn't care less. Robert could drop dead the next day and she'd be fine. Eleanor got the guy she really likes. And, by the way, a substantial living. Like, not wealth, but they're going to be fine. Yeah. Marianne got a mansion, it's true. But, like, it's almost like she's like, fine, this is the world. Like, your comment made me think about that. Like, this is the world, so I'll do it. Not exactly a triumphant moment for the heart of the book, really, in my mind.
Well, yeah. There's a couple paragraphs past where you were reading on 268. It's instead of falling a sacrifice to an irresistible passion, as once she had fondly flattered herself with expecting. So this idea that that actually being in love was the sacrifice. There's this very creaky feeling reversal, right? That oh no, the real sacrifice would have been marrying a man for love.
Right.
The real sacrifice would have been passion.
Yeah.
Right? Instead of that, right? She finding her only pleasures in retirement and study, as afterwards, in her more calm and sober judgment she had determined on, she found herself at 19 submitting to new attachments, entering on new duties, placed in a new home,
a
wife, the mistress of a family, and the patroness of a village.
Yeah.
It's like she skips from 17 to 60.
Yeah.
And
which is not what Stevie Nicks meant in The Edge of 17.
Not at all.
No.
And I get it. Right? Yeah. But I feel like the punishment is all out of proportion. Okay, so she's a little wild.
Yeah, I mean, she didn't even really do anything, that a preacher would be upset about if it was his daughter.
She rides to see his house.
Yeah.
And that seems to be the most scandalous thing.
Yeah,
she's like kind of alone with him for an afternoon at his aunt's house.
Well, I mean, and a lot of it, though, don't you think is symbolic? Like I noticed a little detail, like physically what triggered the illness. I mean, we know why she got her sick, was to punish the silliness out of her. Yeah. But like even the physical trigger, she had like neglected. She got her shoes wet. Yeah. Like, and it's like, oh, how dare you get a little wet to go back to Sedgwick, right? Like, this. I felt like there was a little bit of Freudian stuff going on there, but really, what she's guilty of is experiencing desire.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's like, damn,
Yeah.
we're going to beat her to death over that.
Right. Well, experiencing desire that's like untempered by whatever this
Yeah.
iron will that Eleanor has,
Yeah.
or whatever. And so I feel like, whatever else the book does, I'm distracted by what feels like the really just heaping of punishment
Yeah.
that happens to Marianne. That somehow I'm supposed to feel like the happy ending here is that she's like somber and studious, and placed as a wife,
And has duties.
and a patroness.
Yeah.
And it just sounds grim.
Yeah.
To me.
Yeah, I mean, and she does. I mean, she does go on to say, right after that passage you read, I think she understands that people aren't going to see this as the kind of Pride and Prejudice of it all. But she says here, Colonel Brandon was now as happy as all those who best loved him believed he deserved to be. In Marianne, he was consoled for every past affliction. Her regard and her society restored his mind to animation and his spirits to cheerfulness. So, yay, Brandon. Then, on the back end of that semicolon, and that Marianne found her own happiness in forming his, was equally the persuasion and delight of each observing friend. Marianne could never love by halves, and her whole heart became in time as much devoted to her husband as it had been to Willoughby. And that's one of the only moments where I kind of sit back and I go, you know what, Jane, I don't believe you. I don't believe you. And like, maybe that's just me being an asshole, but I just feel like that was her being like, oh, well, don't worry, she loved him.
Look, it took 6 or 7 pages
Yeah.
to untangle Mrs. Jennings' confusion at the beginning of today's reading about whether Colonel Brandon had proposed to Eleanor.
Right.
6 pages.
Right.
You can't give me 1 page, or I'm sorry, 1 sentence, half a sentence.
Yeah.
That says, oh, by the way, Eleanor's in love.
Or Marianne's
Marianne's in love. I don't know. No, that's a like, oh, what's that? Oh, sure, yeah, she's fine.
Right.
It's really dismissive.
Yes.
And I think what that says to me is that this is not the point. This is not the function. This is not why Marianne's here. She's here as this cautionary tale. She's a corrective, right? That what we're really supposed to care about is that Eleanor gets to marry Edward Ferrars.
And what is it about Edward that we're supposed to say is such a good model of masculinity? Like, we know that Willoughby's a cad. Mm-hmm. We know we're supposed to like Brandon because Brandon, he duels, he fights for people's honor, he hooked Edward up, he went and got Mama when Marianne was sick. Right. But Colonel Brandon is not perfect, but he's a good guy, I get that. What is it about Edward that, like, Eleanor finds so, like, she speaks of his integrity, and in a way you get the sense that because he won't dump Lucy, like, that's supposed to be the big symbol of why he's so great.
Right.
And I don't know if I buy him as, like, even all that interesting, let alone great.
Yeah, I'm not trying to say that he's as bad as Willoughby.
Yeah.
But in that kind of early days of Barton Cottage, when he just shows up unexpectedly on horseback, he's not much better than Willoughby.
No.
And I have a really hard time seeing. I don't know. I think I sent you the video of the band, the two sisters, who have the song about the Colin Firth. Mr. Darcy.
Yeah, Colin Firth's Mr. Darcy. Yeah,
and how like seeing this movie when they were like 13, ruined the sisters forever.
Yeah.
And thought like anybody with an English accent who treated them like trash must just be terrific. Yeah. And I kind of feel like this bears out a little bit. I think Edward treats Eleanor badly. Now he stops treating her badly.
Sure.
But as is sort of the case with Willoughby, I'm not just not so moved by his explanation. It's kind of the same thing. It was like, well, I was in a tight spot and I sort of meant it.
Yeah.
Even though.
Yeah.
And like the dude in me wants to be like, well, yeah, I mean, he meant it.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I don't see him as some big prize. I don't see any of these men
Right.
as big prizes.
Yeah.
Certainly some are worse. But it seems like the best you can hope for is a guy who's not like actively working against you.
Yeah.
In some ways, like a guy who's gonna like mostly ignore you. Seems to be, like hopefully he has like, a hobby.
I mean, and speaking of the novels, I think in some ways dismissible of like persuasive reasons for love, which again, this book is about economics, and it's why arguably Lucy's the hero. I mean, I know this video is kind of probably going against, maybe there are critics that agree with this. I've only read what's in this book,
Right.
but I mean, damn, I'm not really at any point, for all Brandon's virtue in other ways, like I see no reason why Brandon loves her. Like if I were sitting down with Colonel Brandon with a glass of brandy and a cigar, I feel like the best the man could do would be like, she reminds me of that first girl I loved. She looks a little bit like Eliza did, and I just
so creepy,
and I just
so problematic.
Yeah, and it's like, well, okay,
and he's pretty open about this with
Eleanor.
Marianne's mother.
Yeah, and I'm like, really, like at least say something about her music, like don't make me infer it. Like say something about her zest for life. Say something about, like, I don't know, all the reasons the reader likes Marianne, right? Like the reader likes her.
Yeah.
Why can't, I don't know. Like I feel like Marianne's really the only, or Eleanor, excuse me, is really the only one that gets that while Marianne's a pain in the ass, she's very lovable also, and has many good qualities, including the fact that when the chips are down, she stands up for Eleanor. But Brandon, I just don't feel like he'd do a very good job of itemizing for me why you're so over the moon for this 17-year-old anyway.
I don't think Brandon's a terrible guy.
Yeah.
And I think, especially in context, 1811,
Right.
all that.
Right.
But I also can't help but think, I don't know that you're quite the watcher of The Sopranos that I was.
Nah.
But there's this scene, one of the conceits of the show is that, Tony Soprano, this mob boss, is having anxiety attacks and has to go see a therapist about it. And of course the therapist is Lorraine Bracco. You know, and so Tony hits on her like their second or third session. Yeah. And just expects to be able to sleep with his therapist. Yes. And she turns him down. Yeah. Politely but pretty firmly. Yeah. Turns him down, and to kind of like save face, with her. He kind of like sour grapes her, right? He's like, well, I don't need this. He goes, I already got a mistress. Yeah. And in this like kind of perfect rendition of like, the 20th century asshole. Yeah, right? Yeah. He goes, 22 Russian. Yeah. And I kind of feel a little echo of that. Like, yes. What is Colonel Brennan interested in? He's interested in this kind of like adolescent spark.
Yeah. I mean, Edward, at least, for all his flaws, you get the impression, okay, it's who Eleanor is. Yeah. Like, Eleanor and Edward are drawn to each other because of who they are. Yeah. Even though I agree with everything you said about Edward, I feel like Edward could give a pretty good account of why he's in love with Eleanor if you sat him down. Yeah. He'd say all the other bullshit about how I was in a tight spot and I meant it and I didn't and this and that. But he'd be able to be like, oh yeah, Eleanor's cool because of these reasons. And he would be able to tell you in a way that would make you believe, okay, the wedding's on. But with Brandon, you're right. I mean, it just feels like a toy and entertainment, a consolation for a life of hardship. Like
when Edward shows up, right before this denouement about Lucy and Robert, when Edward shows up, like he is affected. Yeah. He's feeling things. Yeah. And we don't really get to pull the curtain back, but he's by Eleanor's side for like weeks. Yeah. Like he's not going to go home. Right. And so like whatever else. Yeah. Like there's something there. He's like going on long walks.
They have the real deal.
He's doing that stuff that like marriage counselors
Yeah.
He's listening to her.
Yes.
He clearly like respects her like abilities, that kind of thing. Now, but then I'm back to this like, okay, but like, is that it? I mean, like maybe I'm not being fair. Right. I guess ultimately what I'm saying, and maybe this is the win. Yeah. Maybe this is what Jane Austen sort of like this is where she gets to mark one, for me. But by 260 pages in, I am so invested in Eleanor that anything short of the moon and the stars, I'm like, she deserves more.
She does deserve more, yeah.
And maybe she feels good about the situation with Edward. One of the things that occurs to me just now, is because of his kind of like semi disinheritance or whatever. I know that there's some partial redemption.
Yeah, like, well, Robert's not going to get cut off, and so you feel like, okay, neither is Edward. Well, there was some money that they got.
The book tells us that he doesn't get his full thing.
But he gets some like 10,000 pounds.
Yeah, he gets something. But because he's still kind of on the outs.
Yeah.
Right. One of the things Eleanor and I guess Edward have done is they have stepped out of the game.
Yeah.
Like they don't have to turn into Sir John,
right?
Or Mrs. Jennings or whatever, and maybe this is part of the win, right? Is that they get to go be real people instead of whatever this is. And maybe that's part of what Eleanor loves about him is that he is. I mean, he is like I guess for everything I'm gonna reverse course here. Like after kind of like crapping on him for a while, I will say he's pretty quick to be like, hey, I can beat 4.
Yeah.
Like he's pretty like ready to go like do this thing.
Oh, you got the impression that if Lucy had held him to it all the way, he would have married her and been poor.
Right.
And he was as shocked as anybody that Brandon offered him this.
Right.
This he didn't expect that either.
No. I mean,
so he thought he was going to wind up with nothing.
So I mean, like, and aside from just this being kind of like a ride or die thing, it's a kind of lack of investment in the society that I think kind of goes along with Eleanor's kind of careful understanding of how precarious things are within this world. And I mean, this is kind of the story, right, in general. These novels that deal with this kind of capital S society is and we mentioned this, I think, a couple readings ago, just like how very, like, delicate the surface tension is and how quickly you can just sink. And they kind of opt out is what it seems like. It is kind of interesting to me that what this means ultimately is, both sisters and their husbands are living essentially in the same single family compound.
Sure, yeah.
There's this kind of lack of scope, in that sense. I think we're supposed to believe that, that Lucy is going to be her own punishment to Robert. The same way that
Willoughby's going to suffer.
What's her name is going to be Willoughby's punishment.
Gray, Miss Gray.
And so I mean, I feel like there is a bit of a bow, tied on this, but as I think, as we said at the beginning, ultimately it just rings kind of flat.
After a fantastic build-up.
And I think what I want to say is ultimately I feel like Marianne and Eleanor were both treated badly by the novel. Marianne more so. But neither of them got what they deserved, but the novel's trying to convince me otherwise in this way that goes against the very good kind of perceptive understanding of the world that the narrator gave us up until that last 50
I would feel more respected if the narrator, who has been snarky all along, and Johnson also points that out, that like in some ways this is your most intrusive Austen narrator, I think she suggests, of any of the novel. We'll see what we think about that when we move on. But if the narrator had just come out in the end and been like, listen, they didn't get what they deserve because people don't, because everything sucks, but at least they're okay now. Instead of like trying, like you said, to be like, oh, don't worry, they're fine. And I'm just like, oh, come on. Like, you can't paint this grim picture and then give them an ending that we all know is kind of on the either boring or grim side. And then act like I'm supposed to think that it's this, in Johnson's words, that passage you quoted, supposedly benevolizing institutions of order Property, Marriage, and Family. Like, don't ask me to believe this is a celebration of the institution of marriage. The end of this book, like if anything, yes, thank God, Eleanor and Marianne aren't tossed to the wolves entirely, by the Lucys of the world. But I'm not going to treat this as a happy ending either.
No,
So I don't know.
Yeah, I fantastic book.
Yeah.
Really, really well put together.
Yeah. Held my attention the whole time.
Fumbled on the 3-yard line.
Yeah, fumbled on the 3-yard line, I think might be our final verdict. And I don't have it memorized, but we're going to do the second novel next, whichever.
Pride and Prejudice.
Oh, Pride and Prejudice is the next one published?
What I have listed next,
Okay.
1813.
Okay.
So we'll take some time and order that.
Yeah.
And then come back with that one. I think there's probably going to be another 3 episodes. Maybe 4.
Yeah, we'll take a look at how long it is.
I'm remembering that one being kind of longish, but I might be wrong.
Yeah.
So,
and even that one, like I say, I've read it and Emma, but this is the first Austen I've read since I was in my 20s. So it's been a good, quarter century. So it's like I'm not going to be like I said, I remember Emma the best.
Right.
But Pride and Prejudice is going to come to me as a surprise in a lot of ways too. Even though I know it ends in big marriages, and I know who's going to hook up that time, which I didn't with this.
Right. I think I want to say it was 22 years ago that I read Pride and Prejudice. So, so I will remember little bits of it, but a lot of it will be as if new. I think to me. So, but I look forward to it.
It's been good,
and we'll do that next time.
All right. Goodbye, Sense and Sensibility.